Angel's Egg is about abandoning one's faith. That's what everybody says about it anyway. And when I say everyone, I mean everyone. Take a look at any analysis of this film and you're sure to come across this theory before long, that Angel's Egg is some sort of metaphor for abandonment of one's faith in favor of nihilism, perhaps even in favor of Gnosticism, though admittedly a Gnostic reading of Angel's Egg is typically one of selective indulgence and does require greater suspension of disbelief in order to grant such a conclusion. No, perhaps Gnosticism isn't exactly what creator Mamoru Oshii had in mind, but surely some heretical corruption of Christianity must be involved, right? The imagery is too biblical, too specific, in the eyes of many, to be telling any other sort of story. That's why countless accounts of the supposedly deep philosophy of Angel's Egg find themselves wrapped up in the narrative that what it depicts is a world wherein God abandoned Noah, and those few faithful angels, quote-unquote, who do remain, have begun to lose faith in that God who left them behind. If you watch Angel's Egg with that mindset, understanding it as an art film with very little dialogue depicting man's loss of faith, what you'll find is that it won't take you more than an afternoon to come to peace with what you've seen. That's because the evidence to support this interpretation is so plentiful, so seemingly blatant, that it almost seems unmistakably obvious. In order to understand why, let's break down the film and preface that analysis with the claim that Angel's Egg is, for absolute certainty, making a statement on the loss of faith. I'm Octo, and today in my corner we're going to be breaking down and analyzing not just the art of Angel's Egg itself, but also the history of the film, and the history of its many interpretations. Welcome aboard. As stated in the intro, the vast majority of people believe Angel's Egg to be a deep meditation on faith, blind faith, mass faith, and the eventual loss of that faith. Looking at the film with that supposed meaning aside, it seems easy to come to that conclusion, all on your own. To show what I mean by that, let's analyze Angel's Egg on the grounds that it is, in fact, about the slow loss of faith. Before we go any further with this, I'd like to preface everything that comes next by stating that you can't really talk about Angel's Egg without the conversation getting at least a little religious. I say this because I'd like to place a sort of trigger warning here before things get too, ecclesiastical. If you're not into religious stuff and you don't want to be a part of discussion on it, or religious discussion makes you uncomfortable, that's totally fine. I understand completely, you can go ahead and click off this video. It's definitely not one for everybody. Additionally, I've tried as best I can to keep my analysis unbiased, at least when not otherwise stated or acknowledged in some way. My goal is to understand the art itself and the story therein, not to preach to you or something similar to that. That said, there are certainly parts of this video where it might sound like I am, so in those moments, try not to take anything I say too personally. I acknowledge that these topics are sensitive to some people, and as such, I did try my best to be tasteful and respectful, as I always do, in my discussion of Angel's Egg. All of that said, if I do offend any of you in any way with the way I discuss this film, I deeply apologize. Finally, if you haven't seen the film before, it's an art film. It's hard to understand. It's not something you can watch in the background. You're going to need to interpret it and give it your full attention. Understanding while doing so that pretty much everything you're seeing is metaphorical, rather than literal. Unfortunately, as a result, this video might not make a ton of sense at first to those of you who've never seen the film, but rest assured by the end the events which transpire in Angel's Egg will probably at least be pretty clear, though I still can't promise anything you see or hear today will make perfect sense. All of that out of the way, what is it about Angel's Egg that creates such a strong impression that the film is about losing one's faith with so many viewers? Let's break it down. The first clue about Angel's Egg is right in the name, the egg itself. Yeah, I too thought I was done talking about eggs for a while, but I guess those recurring nightmares about eggs aren't going to go away just yet, huh? Anyway, the egg can easily be viewed as a symbolic representation of faith itself. The girl believes there is undoubtedly a bird growing within it, and she, with each passing day, more eagerly awaits the day when it will hatch and become a new bird. Presumably, the bird will then leave and, I don't know, bring back an olive branch or something. We can actually see how strongly she believes this simply by looking at the way that she's animated. Watch how she interacts with the egg, keeping it safe, rubbing it, and smiling at it, almost as though it's some sort of pet. Clearly, the girl truly does care for this and actually believes in it. And when she meets the boy later on, who believes differently, she's actively shown to distrust him until the moment he's shown to have protected her egg for her. In other words, she believes him to be a man of faith too, and therefore believes in him. And with a design like his, who could blame her? Bandages cover his hands in the spot where you'd expect nail prints to be, and he literally carries his own cross with him. It's as if in this scene he's essentially calling himself a savior, or saying bluntly, "I am Jesus Christ." More bluntly than that, however, is the scene involving the phantom fish, one of the most harrowing and jaw-dropping scenes in the entire film. A town full of people erupts to life when suddenly the shadows of giant fish appear throughout the town, chasing them with reckless abandon. In their haste and desperation for fish, which the girl informs us have all been gone for ages now, the people abandon things like water completely. I've seen people theorize that this scene acts as a metaphor for blind faith and chasing religion, but I think the metaphor here is a bit more clear in terms of faith when we look at the history Christians associate with Jesus Christ himself. Sorry in advance, we're going to get a bit biblical here for a second, but I feel it's justified by the context, so hopefully that doesn't offend anyone here. To understand this fish scene's religious significance more clearly, we need to turn to the accounts of Christ's life as written in the Bible, specifically the King James Version, because that's the one I read, and there were too many translations out there to cross-reference all of them for one YouTube video. Anyway, of Christ's 12 chosen disciples, a good number were fishermen. When they were having a rough time one particular day, unable to catch fish on their own, Christ told the men where to cast their nets, and though his instructions didn't seem to make any sense to them, they cast the nets as instructed and found fish aplenty, so much so they apparently had to start throwing them back. After Christ's crucifixion, the disciples went back to being what they had been before, only for a now risen Jesus to appear again and instruct them again on where to find fish, because again, they could not catch any fish on their own without his guidance. Now, take a look at the way the men chase after the mere shadows of fish here, unable to ever catch them. If the underlying metaphorical meaning of God having forgotten his people is to be believed, this scene refers not to a show of blind faith, but a lack of divine input. God has left them with no instruction, and as such they have lost their faith, turning back to being fishers of fish instead of what Jesus Christ actually instructed his disciples to do in the Bible story, that being to become fishers of men. Preachers, in other words. You'll note that ignoring the water fountain is also an important suggestion that this is the case. Again, looking to biblical accounts, we can see something a bit more thematic is going on here. When you look in John chapter 4, verses 6 to 15, Jesus refers to himself as the living water, stating that if men drink the water he gives them, they shall never thirst again. This is all meant to be metaphorical in its original context, and refers to spiritualism more than literal thirst-killing water, but it's not my job to interpret religious text for YouTube views or preach Christianity to you. My personal beliefs, and whether or not I believe in Christianity, aren't really the point I'm trying to make here. I only bring the Bible, of all things, into this at all to prove that it's possible Oshii is using this specific imagery to show us that rather than acting in blind faith, these people are acting with none at all. It's no coincidence, after all, that the only person who actually drinks any water in the film at all is the same person who continues to believe in the egg. In other words, the girl is the only person who has faith in God. Hence why she pities the fishermen in their chase of that which they should be smart enough to know doesn't exist. If these fish really did represent blind faith in religion, it doesn't seem likely that the character portrayed as having the most faith would say so sadly that truth be told, I don't blame the guys for chasing these fish. According to the shapes of those shadows, all those are coelacanths, and as any Animal Crossing player can tell you, you do not let one of those things get away without a fight.
You're gonna spend those real quick. We got it! Blast from the past!
Bottom line though, on a spiritual level, the fish scene seems to be more likely to represent man's abandonment of his faith in God to pursue earthly needs, like food or career, rather than a showcase of the problematic nature of blind faith, though both interpretations are valid and do have merit in the grand scheme of things. Arguably, both are equally important messages as well, depending on your viewpoints, but that's not what we were talking about. No better example of the film being about abandoning faith is found than with Jesus-coded boy himself, ironically enough. At several points throughout the film, his body language and facial expressions place him in a state of near isolationism, and at every possible turn, the framing of these shots informs us that he views himself as separate from the girl, likely implying their difference in beliefs. Additionally, his comments regarding the egg, about how it needs to be cracked open if the contents are ever to be known, showcases his lack of trust and faith. He cannot bring himself to believe, even for a second, that things will work out on their own. Instead, he has to see it with his own eyes to believe that it exists, and seeing the beliefs of this girl frustrate him as a result, because in his eyes, that type of viewpoint is more than simply harmlessly stupid. It's unthinkably dumb. That's not to say this makes the boy a bad character or a bad person. None of that could be further from the truth. He's simply acting according to his ideals, though that does admittedly lead to him hurting the girl through his actions by the end of it all. Finally, we come to the giant eyeball ship thing. This bit is one of the harder parts of Angel's Egg to come to terms with and understand, but if we stick to our abandoned faith narrative, it is a little simpler to unpack the metaphors that might be at play here. This giant ship could be a stand-in for the watchful eye of God, thus explaining the shape and the hordes of praying statues it has collected. And I say collected because by the end of the movie there's actually an additional statue on it, that being the girl with her egg. What this could be shown to mean is that God did not abandon his human creations at all, at least not entirely. By collecting them after death and keeping the faithful ones close to him, it's almost as if he's decided to take the chosen few who act in faith with him rather than leave them to the ark. Like, the rapture or something. I could go into much more depth about why this makes sense from both a narrative and animation perspective, but just for the sake of time, I'll let you come to your own conclusions about why this might be the case for now. So, there you have it. By looking at everything we have up until now, it does seem like the intent is to share a message on faith, both its importance and the dangers of it. All of this in mind, the only way to know for sure is to check the intentions of the film's creator. Among those who have seen the film, perhaps the most knowledgeable is one Chris Stuckman, who's made his own analysis of the film known in several ways, both in print and online. While under normal circumstances my next course of action would be to contact Chris directly for input, I don't have the kind of view counts for me to feel comfortable doing that without it coming across as tacky. But luckily for me, his video on Angel's Egg already gives us more than enough information to go off of. According to Stuckman's analysis, this faith-based approach to a viewing of Angel's Egg is completely justified because of Oshii's own crisis of faith, which Chris infers must have occurred because Mamoru Oshii left the pursuit of seminary studies in favor of becoming a director. Based on a surface-level viewing of Oshii's own account, or even a more in-depth look at his personal life, this conclusion seems obvious. It's what appears to be a watertight theory. After all, Oshii did study Christianity and did quit seminary to become a director. That said, the specifics of these details and their meanings are a little less cut and dry than Stuckman implies. According to Oshii himself, he studied the beliefs to better understand his Christian friends. Given that Japanese typically don't identify as particularly religious, and that Shintoism, Japan's national religion, is itself not comprised of any actual doctrine or holy text, the conclusion that Oshii never had any serious underlying faith or crisis thereof isn't as far-fetched as it may initially seem. This explains the common biblical themes present throughout Oshii's other works, in fact, such as Ghost in the Shell or Patlabor. He simply thinks it's cool to do it that way, and who could blame him? Additionally, Oshii's own account of Angel's Egg includes the fact that he doesn't actually know what it's about. But notably, he is also quoted as saying that it isn't the responsibility of the director to assign meaning to his works, but instead it is up to the audience to find meaning in the film for themselves. In my opinion, this is Oshii's way of saying that even if we could come to the same conclusion about Angel's Egg as Oshii did when he created it, we'd be no better off, because it doesn't really matter what he intended Angel's Egg to mean. All that matters is that it means something unique to us, the viewers. In that regard, nothing about Stuckmann's interpretation is wrong or even misguided. Despite what I said earlier, I don't actually disagree with Chris in the slightest. In fact, his review makes perfect sense on more than simply an objective level. When we take into account what we know about Stuckmann himself, including his own crisis of faith, his interpretation of Angel's Egg as a critique of blind faith, the exact type of blind faith that he himself suffered as a result of throughout his life, not only holds merit as an analysis, but becomes a message in and of itself, one so powerful that it changes the way we view the film on its own. There was a point during the making of this video where I stopped doing research on Angel's Egg. That point was when I read the exact statement from the creator referred to earlier. The one that stated he didn't actually know what the film is about. I stopped researching at this point so that I could watch the film again, with the intent to see something in it that I'd never seen in it before, the intent to interpret it for myself. Additionally, I stopped because that statement sounded familiar somehow, almost like I'd heard it before, and recently heard it before at that. Enter American live-action and animation director Wes Anderson. None of the cast of Anderson's latest bizarrely entertaining theatrical release, Asteroid City, seem to have the slightest idea what the film is actually about. And as for the director himself, he's remained incredibly tight-lipped about the subject of meaning within the film. It's a movie that many audiences can't quite seem to get a grasp on. And unlike Anderson's previous works, which, despite containing metaphorical significance in incredibly deep ways, all can be viewed, if desired, on a simply literal level without much confusion, this one is very, very different. In other words, all of Anderson's previous works at least conform to a typical storytelling 3-act structure. Sorry to spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen the film yet, but to put it bluntly, Asteroid City does not. I bring this up to say that when Wes Anderson refuses to comment on the meaning or intent of Asteroid City, what he silently instructs us to do is find a meaning for ourselves within the work. In words different from those, it doesn't matter what he wants it to mean. It only matters what it means to those who watch it. As a result, I think it will be incredibly interesting to see what kinds of video essays come out about the film, and what kinds of people are making them. Keep an eye out, and maybe, if you've always wanted to give creating analysis videos a try, start with Asteroid City. I know I'll be watching, and listening, to everything you have to say on the subject. Of particular interest to me is the way the film seems to be about finding meaning in the abstract or unclear. From dealing with death, to discovering life from outside our planet, to falling in love, to publishing an unfinished play, or even to acting in one. Asteroid City encourages us to find meaning in the seemingly meaningless. And more importantly than that, it encourages us to find it for ourselves. That is what is meant in part by the tagline which is repeated throughout the film. The line, "You can't wake up if you don't fall asleep." What I've understood this line to mean, in layman's terms, is that you can't ever have an aha moment unless you first allow yourself to be confused. You can't decide anything if there's no decision to be made to begin with. And that you, as an individual, have to come to that conclusion and suffer that confusion for yourself in order to make any sort of informed decision, or at least a decision which carries value. You can't dream if you're awake. You can't have your own interpretation if you base it off of the work of others rather than off of your own findings. You can't solve a puzzle if you don't think about it. You can't wake up if you don't fall asleep. And that's why, determined to find a meaning for myself in this convoluted, fantastical sci-fi masterpiece, I determined to watch the film again, with a notepad and a pen. And just to address the elephant in the room and make it clear of the way this video was made in the first place, let me just explain a few things. Yes, I was aware of the perception that Angel's Egg is about a crisis of faith before making this video, but only loosely. I hadn't, for example, seen Chris Stuckman's analysis, or any other analysis for that matter. I'd simply read the Wikipedia article on it and found, based on what the rest of the article said, that the subject of meaning within the film is one of great public debate, and as such, I decided that I should watch the film for myself before doing any further research. And despite the fact that the faith-based analysis came much earlier in this video, it's actually the second of the two analyses that I did chronologically, because the very first thing I did after reading this particular portion of the Wikipedia article was find myself a way to watch Angel's Egg, and hold on tight to the feeling that I needed to interpret what Angel's Egg means to me, regardless of if that interpretation lines up with the metaphor for faith-based views of popular opinions or not. The first thing you'll notice about Angel's Egg is the way it moves. The animation is seemingly entirely on ones. This is interesting for reasons we'll get into later, but the gist of it is that this is a more Western animation style than Japanese, though assigning any sort of nationality to something like animating on ones is nothing short of silly, to be frank. Point is, animation on ones is noteworthy for a project like this, so remember that. Beyond that fact, the contents of the shot itself are noteworthy on their own. When we see a childish, ghostly white hand transition to a less pale shade, we hear the sound of an egg breaking apart. The significance of this is that it's all foreshadowing the events of the film. The first, more pale hand matches the girl's complexion, whereas the hand we see when the sound is played is a perfect match for the boy. Thus, we already know the boy will break the egg, or at least attempt to. The image of a baby growing in a shell, unable to open its eyes, seems to represent a few different ideas, but most notably to me, the fact that a bird can eventually hatch on its own and see the world beyond the interior of its egg. But, if aided in the hatching process by a human interference, the bird may never gain the strength it needs to survive beyond the egg. It must decide on its own to exit the egg. Or metaphorically, one must be allowed to grow on one's own before they go out into the world, lest they be too weak to handle the many tribulations that it contains. That isn't to encourage people to never leave home. Quite the opposite, actually. It's just to say that they shouldn't be expected to before they're ready. This is something we'll get into later on, but make sure to keep it in mind as we move forward with our analysis. Next up, we see the arrival of one who knows, or of artificiality. Though not even I can stretch Angel's Egg to be a Shintoist nature versus man metaphor here, it's just not that kind of film. No, I believe this is a religious leader we're seeing. I'll explain why in just a bit, but next up is the ship, or whatever this thing is supposed to be. What I see here is the collection of masses of people, disguised as an eyeball. The eyeball represents truth in other media, but limited and deceitful truth. We can see examples of this in shows like Flowers of Evil and Full Metal Alchemist, though obviously those couldn't have been an influence on this particular film. Let's take a look at this glance the boy gives the, we'll call it the masses here. The look he gives the masses is one of almost hateful disdain, as though he looks down upon the floating masses despite their altitude. Perhaps this is meant to show that the boy is the leader of the masses, that he asks people to believe in his truth, converting them to his way of thinking, and as such controls them. Of course, he never actually interacts with them as a mass, instead simply gathering followers and sending them off to be one of his masses. He's sending them to mass, in other words. This also explains his outfit referencing Jesus Christ in design, And though we did go over those further before, it has been a little while since then, so here's a little chart I'll bring up if we ever need a refresher from now on. Anyway, this Christ figure is a false god or figurehead of religion. He's collected masses of followers and is actively looking for more, watching the masses and controlling them from afar. As we see later, he isn't afraid to go to war in order to convince them, towering atop biomechanical H.R. Geiger-esque weaponry as he combs the land in search for more people to add to his flock of so-called truthful believers. We'll get into this more later on, but for now, let's get to the girl herself. Take a look at the harsh shadows and lights in this shot. From their no doubt purposeful inclusion, we can glean that she is awoken not of her own accord, but by the action of another. Likely the man who controls the masses just outside her dwelling place. Can't be woken if you don't fall asleep, after all. She is being acted upon rather than acting for herself. She is a bird who is being manually hatched rather than being allowed to do so when she's ready. Instead, forced awake by this harsh, uninvited lighting. Then there's the egg. The egg was not laid. If it had been, the girl would probably have noticed it or questioned it in some way. Therefore, we can infer that the egg is normal and has been there a while, but that she did not lay it. When she exits the chamber in which she wakes, the feeling of relief is palpable. This is a recognizable landscape, for the first time so far. Immediately after this happens, we see an angelic depiction of her watching over her own land. From here on out, I'm going to call her Angel, as I believe this girl is what the title, Angel's Egg, is referring to. But there's more to this moment than just establishing that on its own. This shot holds long enough for us to realize that she's looking back down the tunnel, inward, not outward. This, metaphorically, tells us that when Angel sees the world outside her own view, she refuses to allow it to change her internal perception of reality. Before we move any further, I'd just like to say that the angelic-sounding music further implies that this character is likely the titular angel. Okay, cool. On the subject of music, though, as it plays, the screen is black, and this gives us time to think. Red is not necessarily being used for evil or intrusion in a literal sense. This is not nature versus man or something similar, because red is also associated with Angel smiling and being content. Therefore, the red coloration does not on its own have significance as a color in the opening scenes. You could say that this means Angel is avoiding seeing any red flags or deliberately avoiding caution, but that seems a stretch, in my opinion at least. Which reminds me, this man, the only not masses character we've seen so far other than Angel, holds a weapon of some kind and is dressed in a hero cape and war uniform. I believe he is the god of the masses. He is their leader. He is the source of knowledge. That eye is his. However, the Angel does not recognize him, and this is significant. She asks him, an accusatory-sounding phrase in any language, though not in this case intended to offend. This is not true sacredness, or in any way related to the Angel, and that is important. All dialogue is important integrally because there's so little of it in Angel's Egg, and that being the case, I'm going to make every effort to analyze as much of it as I possibly can. The title tells us that the egg belongs to Angel. Based on what we now know, the hatching scene was a dream that the Angel had, which represented the impending invasion by the truth of the masses. This dream was a reminder to find one's own truth rather than to allow someone else to tell you who you are. That identity must be grown into by oneself before one is ready to examine the views of others. You need to know for yourself what you are and what you believe before you believe what anyone else tells you. The Angel was interrupted before she was ready, and this tells us she is vulnerable to the masses' ideals and lacks her own resolve or will. So let's talk about the egg for a second before we go any further. Her egg is a metaphor for her truth. The egg represents her faith, but also her identity. That is hers, but it is fragile and has not hatched. It can still be destroyed if she does not care for it very carefully. And this is why the truth of the masses is dangerous. to her. Next, during the credits, the dream egg has clearly hatched. While we don't see this happen, my theory is that it happened forcefully, ungracefully. The boy broke it with his weapon, I think. We can actually confirm this in theory by consulting his later dialogue about seeing a tree with an egg in it, where a bird had slept, and, most notably, that the whole experience might have been a dream he had, or a false memory. When she walks through the emptiness of the world at large following the opening credits, Angel is alone. There are whisperings about her. Her expression is unsure. This is the fear that she stands out. There was safety in her room, her picturesque outside world which she saw but did not learn from. This could represent doubt, or the moment one leaves one's childhood, but this moment's significance continues when we see her walk past the creepy-looking trees in the forest, which kind of reminds me of the dark woods from Snow White. Yes, the Disney one, and yes, I think it's intentional, and yes, there's meaning in that if it's the case. But in order to explain what that meaning is, we need to go down a bit of a rabbit hole real quick, if you'll indulge me. The history of animation itself is tied, unquestionably, to the history of Disney. I don't mean for television, and I am aware of both the modern reputation of the company, which is to say that its modern productions are lackluster and shallow compared to something like Angel's Egg, and I don't mean to sweep aside the dubious practices of the company even in its early days. From blatant sexism to monopolization to openly racist depictions of stereotypes, the explanation for which is, in and of itself, a video I would really like to make someday separate of all of this. Early American animation is not something anybody is really going to argue holds up in today's hyper-politically correct society very well. This is not the discussion I'm referring to when I say we need to look back at the Disney company to understand something like the forest shot in Angel's Egg. No, what I'm saying is that Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs really matters to this discussion for two specific reasons. Firstly, because it was the first fully animated, fully colored feature film ever made. And because it exists, every animated film after it exists. Essentially, what I'm saying is that Angel's Egg containing a reference to Disney's Snow White is far from an unrealistic claim. It is, after all, no coincidence, in my opinion, that Angel's Egg is animated at the exact same 24 frames per second frame rate as Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is, despite Japanese anime typically choosing to animate at 12 to 14 frames per second instead. Secondly, because Snow White, too, is full of metaphor and symbolism beyond the basic storytelling of the film, which honestly is a result of the origins of the fairy tale rather than anything Waltz or anyone on his team really intended to do. According to German historian named Eckhard Sander, more specifically according to a paper he published in 1994 called This, which I'm not even going to try to pronounce here because my Hatsuon is bad enough in Japanese and English, both languages I actually know, so I don't trust myself to try for German, a language I know exactly one word in. Instead, I'll just tell you the English translation, which is roughly something like, Snow White, is it a fairy tale? Anyway, according to that paper, the fairy tale we now know as Snow White is actually originally based on historical events, specifically the account of one Margarita von Waldeck. Waldeck was a countess who was forced to move away by her stepmother at the age of 16 to Brussels, and from there she met some guy named Philip, who was also a prince, and the Seven Dwarfs are based on the children who were enslaved and forced to work in the mines Philip owned, and yada yada yada, all interesting stuff. There's actually a lot of debate about where Snow White came from originally, but the reason I bring it up at all is to make the point that the film, which was primarily made for spectacle, and to prove simply that you could in fact make a movie and have it be animated, and that was a thing filmmakers could do now, contains in part many of the metaphors and cultural inspirations that have carried over from whatever historical events inspired the tale to those elements which were gradually introduced to the story itself. You can't tell the tale of Snow White properly without those metaphors being inherently included, intentionally or otherwise, and I think the forest, which many Disney adults still think is probably scarier than Hereditary or something, is one of those metaphors. Since the film's initial release, its inclusion has been the subject of wide scholarly debate. One particular interpretation I find especially relevant to the forest shot in Angel's Egg is Eddie Eshbar's analysis, which I've linked in the description. in which he said this about the significance of the forest. Quote, "When the huntsman spares Snow White, she flees into the forest and confronts, for the first time in her sheltered life, primeval nature. What she experiences is an ordeal the philosopher Hans Blumenberg refers to as the absolutism of reality, a state of indefinite anticipation, i.e., anxiety, brought on by one's lack of, or perceived lack of, control over the conditions of one's existence. Central to this experience is the degree to which one is perceivable, hence Snow White sensing eyes around her." Close quote. So, when I compared this shot to the type of imagery shown in Snow White, the point I'm trying to make is that the underlying metaphor which had carried over into that scene, one which represents the fear of not having control over one's existence, is being repeated via homage here. And while no, Angel's Egg does not feature Angel being tormented by a group of eyes in the trees, it does, as was mentioned before, substitute those for the whispers of unseen masses, thus suggesting that there are hordes of witnesses to Angel as she runs through the dark and dreary world. This homage to Snow White therefore implies that the intended meaning of both sequences is the same, and as a result is something the audience can breathe a sigh of relief over. This much, at least, we can understand, because we've seen it before. This homage is helpful to understand because it all but confirms everything I've been saying about the film up to this point, and about the fragility and significance of an egg. It can, if nurtured, grow into anything it wants to be, like a personality or beliefs can. The fear comes from it being bothered with before it has fully matured, before it has a proper foundation on which to identify. This explains why Angel hides it beneath her clothes from the sight of the prying, whispering eyes of the onlookers around her. She's trying to protect it, because she's not confident enough in it being her theology, to leave it exposed just yet. She is Adam and Eve, running and hiding her egg, her nakedness, from the watchful eye of God, whoever in this case God may turn out to be. Important to note here is the lack of any sort of expression in her face after that initial fear is shown. Perhaps she's been worn down by others and no longer feels anything at all. The lonely forest clearing represents interpreting for oneself something new in a way that only travel can provide. In this scene, Angel is interpreting what she sees around her and comparing it to her pre-existing beliefs. The feather, which appears in this moment, is soft and inviting. As feathers are typically associated with angels, I've chosen to interpret this as a sign that she's just had an experience which changed her viewpoint, but in a way that she decided for herself. This is an experience that helped shape her into who she is. Rather than be told how to view this area, she was able to simply view it for herself. As such, the egg, though no visual indication is given, has likely come closer to hatching. Each time a feather is seen from now on, we must seek to understand how what has occurred in the moments leading to its arrival have helped Angel to grow, or helped establish her own identity. No sooner is this newfound sense of self gained than is her confidence severely tested, as a sudden impulse from the outside is seen. When next Angel sees water and gazes into it, she is comparing this new sight with her understanding of what she believes it should be, which was gained moments earlier. Finding it to be as expected, she continues on. Angel's new views on this small part of the world have been cemented. Soon after this, we find ourselves following Angel into an unsettlingly empty city. The evidence of water elsewhere within the city implies a shared belief, or evidence of a shared belief, between Angel and those in the city around her, though she is unable to find them, unfortunately. She believes now that others may share her worldview, or at one point did believe the same things that she currently does. Finding the city empty now, however, Angel becomes visibly disappointed. She cannot share her faith with others if they've all gone. Taking and leaving objects is a metaphor for learning from the environment or other cultures. Taking ideas you agree with, leaving ones behind that you don't. This is why she empties the bottle of red juice and goes to fill it with water from the fountain, because she believes this is the right course of action. The first human she does find, the leader of the masses from earlier, glares at her and as such, her trust in people and her belief in herself is now immediately shattered. This is why, when she later finds the water, she is so afraid of the hordes of lifeless people which surround it. She also notes that she is the only one filling up with water, making her feel isolated, separated from her peers in what she believes is right. As a result, the ripples of the water across her body in the next scene are a representation of her wavering ideals as a result of what she has seen. Her faith is now shaking and susceptible. Is it any coincidence, after all, that this is the moment where Angel loses her egg? I don't think so. It's only after these ripples that the man, whom we'll call Preacher based on what we've gleaned from his introduction, appears again. Angel's reaction to him is negative at first, and then slowly it becomes positive. Maybe it won't be so bad after all, she thinks. Maybe he isn't such a bad man. She no longer has the egg, and you'll notice there haven't been any feathers either. This confirms, in my opinion, that her faith in herself and her beliefs is waning. Preacher holds the egg now. As he offers her identity, her beliefs, back to her, he offers in addition a warning. Using kindness and Angel's own beliefs with slight variation, Preacher is attempting to break down the barrier Angel has set, so that he may grow closer to her. This is the first step to getting her to abandon her identity and beliefs in favor of his. His weapon is shaped like a cross, also. Mentioned that before, but, Jesus stuff. I don't know. It's at this point that we get a direct comparison of height between the two. Obviously, Angel is no mother of an egg, she's merely a child, thus enhancing the theory of the egg representing her ideology, faith, and personality. By making small talk in the moments which follow, Preacher is attempting to find ways to get Angel to conform to his beliefs. His most telling phrase, however, is this one, in which he tells her to break the egg in order to see what's inside. Preacher is saying that in order to know the truth, one must abandon the strengths of their beliefs. You must give up parts of your identity, your shell. You must be vulnerable, if his words are to change you. But Angel is not so easily fooled. Again, she asks, "Who are you?" in a way saying, "Who are you to tell me what to believe?" But the damage has already begun. Her already shaken faith now has a few cracks in it. As the two walk together, the music is garbled, ruined by a loud, percussive bell. This is interfering with the angelic tune which previously was associated with Angel, and this is likely because she's now being followed by Preacher. His constant attempts to get her to convert to his beliefs or his religion are pounding away at her, much like that loud, percussive bell. Or, in other words, she is now becoming open to his ideology and susceptible to his manipulation. Angel's Egg seems to consider this a sort of meet cute, which is very strange. That was in my notes, and I don't really know how to incorporate it at all into the rest of the script. It's just like, it's really bizarre, because, I don't know, they treat it like it's supposed to be this funny little... Never mind. You know what? We'll move on. Anyway, Angel trusts Preacher now, but we can clearly see that he has sinister intentions. She now seems almost dependent on him following her, as evidenced by the way that she turns back and looks for him when he doesn't keep up, unable to see him in the dark. The moment he emerges, however, some of that initial fear has clearly returned, and she jumps back and runs off in fright. The house they pass moments later has a wavy fence. Again, that thought of one's sense of self or ideology wavering comes to mind. As we can see, Angel turns back to face him, showcasing that through these times she isn't steadfast in her worldviews. Preacher, however, does not even for a second change his expression. Unlike her, he does not waver, though the world around him does. He knows what he believes. He knows who he is. In the shot with the street lights, further proof is given. One light is on, the other is off. The light allows one to see, and it is through seeing that we open ourselves up to new experiences. The other light being off represents being stubborn or closed off to one's surroundings. Neither is necessarily evil, per se. It simply stands to show us what points of view our characters are seeing from. We can actually tell which light represents which character based on the next shot, wherein Angel is standing and Preacher is sitting. She is higher up than him, though admittedly only in posture because of her height, and is placed directly to his left, parallel to the placement of the lamps from before. The metaphor here is that Angel is open to seeing from new perspectives now, and is trusting enough to allow the light of her character to shine forth and be visible. Preacher, however, both in posture and position, remains closed off to new ideas, indicating that he will either teach her something, or he will do nothing at all. His worldviews are not open to change, as hers are. Both are framed in a closed-off way to one another as well, which could indicate a mutual lack of trust, but the way Angel looks to him again in this shot undermines that. She's making an effort to understand and learn from him, and he doesn't even make the effort to move. When Angel breaks this metaphorical barrier between them, she offers up water to him. But as we understand water to be an extension of her values and beliefs, it should come as no surprise that Preacher immediately rejects them. The way that Angel reacts is clearly evidence of this, reacting as though he's just rejected her theology, rather than just a simple drink of water. When again she turns to him and he offers her aid by way of his coat, she rejects him out of spite. He won't accept her offers, but he will offer her things until she accepts. Another tactic to get through to her. Arriving at what is perhaps the most iconic scene of the film, we can make several observations regarding the meaning of what is being shown here. The fish in question are coelacanths, by the looks of the silhouette, which is a species of truly ancient fish. This fact seems to be meant to imply that there haven't been any fish for quite some time, as in, since ancient times. Metaphysically, however, this species represents change and new beginnings, as well as spiritual transformation. This actually confirms the transformation of Angel's beliefs to those more aligned with Preacher's, in my opinion anyway. We understand from this that she trusts him too much, and has strayed from her identity and religious beliefs to meet his, though not entirely just yet. The fishermen, blind to spirituality or beliefs of any kind, are portrayed monochromatically, as in with one color. Black and white is actually called achromatic because neither black or white are actually colors. Just making sure there's no confusion there. These guys are monochromatic. This portrayal is done so because they have no interest in their own souls, and instead are content with worldly needs, such as food instead of, I don't know, trusting God or something. I'm not a preacher, I don't know, I'm just doing my best, alright? This could explain the empty chapel with its multicolored windows. No other building has any such color, and this is a common thread with both Angel and Preacher. The presence of multiple colors, I mean. This further separates these two from the crowds of fish-hunting non-believers, which in turn further implies that this is a matter of identity and theology between two individuals, with church of some kind being important to either party, but both having substantially different opinions and beliefs regarding it. Of course, Preacher's church is located elsewhere, so perhaps the message is that he's already convinced everyone that used to be here that his truth is the only truth there is. Angel is then pictured fighting with herself. Her and herself, I mean. And just like that, both streetlights come on. Preacher is now capable of change after what he has seen and heard with the fishermen, just as Angel is. The light is on for both, and this story could end either way. Preacher was just changed by what he saw in the actions of the masses that he controls, and masses that he has no control over. The contradiction between the two affecting him internally in some way. And we can see this clearly in the way that his facial expressions change throughout the scene. Angel, however, was changed by the words and actions of just one person, Preacher himself. Finally, of note is the fact that the fishermen cause so much destruction as they hunt their non-existent fish. They destroy what little they have left in the search for what they've lost. Following this, things get very interesting. After a long conversation about Noah's Ark, Angel tries to convince Preacher of the faith that she has in her egg. Preacher doesn't seem to bite. As an observation real quick though, the bones of the fallen creature we see when Angel shows the egg's place of origin seem really eerily similar to those found in Sound of the Sky, which bones are related to the long past and history of the place, which add to the themes of religious identity and theological beliefs present in both that show and this one. That aside though, in a last-ditch effort to be friends with him as herself, without changing, Angel makes a rather simple and frankly honest request of the man that she has come to know. Metaphorical translation of this line is this: promise me you can be my friend without questioning my beliefs. Promise me that you won't destroy what little I have in the search for what you have lost. Unable to believe in her words and unable to accept her beliefs, Preacher takes the egg again while Angel sleeps, and this time succumbing perhaps to his own desperate need to have definitive knowledge of what lies within the egg. He breaks it. Of course, we never see what's actually inside. Either way, it's broken now. Doesn't really matter if there was something in it or not, because the preacher of the masses, the unbelieving preacher of the masses, might I add, has now killed Angel's faith. Her coping mechanism gone, she succumbs to the sadness of the world and dies, the importance of her theology clear in the multitude of eggs which float to the surface. Her childhood beliefs robbed of her, Angel throws herself off a cliff, but does not die a faithful child, but a bitter, cold, soaking adult. Only the memory of what once kept her going to keep her company as she drowns in the cold waters below. Perhaps there really was a bird inside that egg, as evidenced by what we see next, but it doesn't matter. The metaphor of the dream from earlier has come full circle. Preacher has destroyed her egg. That's all we really need to see to understand Angel's egg, really, but of course the film isn't over yet. The feathers shown here are a bleak reminder of his guilt, that the things that she experienced which made her who she is have been taken from her by his drastic actions, both the bird and the angel. Preacher betrayed them all. The ship is the Ark, with its blind masses in prayer to a false truth. Not Noah's Ark, mind you, but his. Preacher's. And as we get one final glance at it, we see that the masses have yet another addition: the angel and her egg. Perhaps they all once believed in something else, only to be converted to mass, meaningless faith by Preacher, who watches as his Ark rises once again. He is the only one who lost sight of his faith, he and the faithless fisherman. All along he had lost sight of what he had been given by Angel and her egg in the first place: mercy. Now he will be alone here forever. Through his own actions he has fulfilled his own prophecy. God has, indeed, forgotten him. Except, perhaps, what we see in the end here is Noah's upturned ark, alone in the waters. Forgotten. Perhaps, but none can say for sure. And that's my analysis of Angel's Egg. Thanks for coming, everybody. Be sure to... Wait, What do you mean it's not over? What do you mean it's not over? Oh, alright, fine. Of course, just to be extra thorough after all that, the best course of action I can think to take is to analyze the film a third time, and this time in a very specific attempt to find every reason I could as to why my interpretation is wrong. Okay, here we go again. First off, this is not an egg. This is not a broken egg. This is an ark with oars coming off of it. I can see that clearly now. I was watching this on a very small screen when I watched it the first time, so it looked like a cracked egg to me at the time. Sorry for keeping you in the dark about that up till now. I'm sure nobody commented about me being wrong about that, and I needed to be the one to say it, so I have. It's an ark. It's not an egg. I was wrong. Anybody who commented that I was wrong, thank you. Additionally, more evidence that this is in fact the Eye of God and not an ark of false truth comes at the end of the film when the Eye of God rises from beneath the waters, carrying Angel with it. The water raining from it almost makes it look as though God is crying about the loss of the angel he sent to be man's last hope. The last faithful person, truly faithful person, is gone. And so now, truly and finally, God actually is abandoning those who had already long since abandoned their faith in him. This explains why the Eye of God appears descending as if from heaven at the beginning of the film, and then rises from the depths after collecting Angel at the end of it, all while mourning the loss of the warrior boy as well as the other faithless fishermen. I swear, I was going to talk about that whole thing earlier, and then I got caught up in something else, and it totally slipped my mind, so I figured I'd talk about it here instead, just to make sure that I did actually reference it, that's probably what this whole sequence is trying to be a metaphor for. Anyway, I'd be remiss also if I didn't mention, at least in passing, the incredible color design of Angel's Egg, though I feel what's been already mentioned in both previous analyses had enough to do with the color coordination that ground has been already covered, but just in case, let's just make mention of that here for a moment. Art directors Yoshitaka Amano and Shichiro Kobayashi were very clear in color design documents about the intentional use of very specific limited color palettes. And to that regard, everyone on staff seems to have really come together in unity to ensure Oshii's vision for Angel's Egg was not obstructed by its palette, but distinctly enhanced by it, to the point that if you watched this film achromatically, one could make the argument that you're missing out on a key aspect of what makes Angel's Egg work in the first place. And they'd probably be right about it, too. Additionally, we could all be completely misunderstanding Angel's Egg on a fundamental level to begin with, by which I mean that it's possible that the entire film might actually be, strictly literal. I know, I didn't want to think about it either at first, but just hear me out for a second. On a purely literal level, everything that happens in Angel's Egg does make some sort of sense. The idea being, well, what if God did just forget people after the whole Ark situation? Be like, forget you guys, I made you guys, you weren't what I wanted, bye, less than the dust of the earth. Y'all know that quote, see? Look, I put it on screen, biblical quotes, haha. Perhaps it's true that God abandoned them in shame because of their disobedience, wickedness, or maybe because they ate all of his apples off his favorite tree. I don't know. But assuming that that's the case, what does Angel's Egg actually do to convince us that this is the case? What evidence do we have that all of this is purely literal? Well, for starters, we have the Ark itself. At the end of the film, we see what looks like a giant Ark, upturned, floating in a vast, endless ocean. Additionally, a lot of the story that the boy tells us toward the end of the film could actually be taken as literal exposition, that everyone forgot why they were on the boat at all after so long, hence why the animals have been reduced to skeletal remains, fossilized after images of what once was. This also explains the giant interior, which the girl actually confirms herself to be her dwelling place from the very beginning. She claims to have found the egg near these remains, and maybe that's strictly literal too. Looking at things from that lens, we can also see that food and water are necessary, but beyond simply drinking the water to satiate her own thirst, we see that she also offers it as tribute to the giant bird who provided her the egg. To the bird, not to God. It's interesting too that after seeing how long she's been offering water up, with one bottle equaling 1 day, presumably, that the boy finds himself unable to believe the egg will ever hatch. Only after he sees how long these efforts have been fruitless does he lose all hope in the egg and smash it himself. So, if all this is true, what exactly is the deal with the weapons the boy rides, the fisherman of stone, and the giant floating eye full of praying people? Well, let's see here. The fishermen at least are fairly obvious on a literal level. Overfishing likely killed the population of fish entirely, as the girl says during the scene itself, actually. As we can see by the design of the buildings, humankind grew rich and arrogant off of the fish. But when the fish all vanished, No longer could they support their lavish lifestyle, and everything was abandoned. Those who couldn't deal with that still hunt the fish as an occupation, maybe knowing deep down that they'll never find what they're looking for, but nevertheless so hungry for the life they once knew that even the shadows that play tricks on their minds lure them into a frenzy over the possibility of hooking even a single fish. In fact, they're so caught up in this fantasy, this dream, that they don't realize that their own actions are destroying the very city and riches that their fishing culture built. The fish giveth, and the fish taketh away. That was so stupid. I'm sorry. Anyway, the giant ship, maybe that is God. Maybe he takes away the faithful, maybe he watches over the ark, or maybe this thing is actually something far more sinister, like the devil, or some giant thing which killed God in the first place, and in so doing stopped the ark, or flipped it, or whatever. Maybe it simply observes and makes copies in stone of what it has seen, hence the statue of the girl appearing at the end of the movie. On a purely literal level, that's what Angel's Egg might be trying to do, and if that's the case, my analysis would be completely incorrect. As would anybody else's, really. In all honesty, though, the most likely answer is that the true solution to Angel's Egg is some sort of mixture of all three interpretations we've gone over today. And that's not even to mention the concords of other analytical takes out there. But all of this is to avoid the most important question. Regardless of which of these three interpretations you found easiest to accept, whichever one gave you closure, does there have to be a right or wrong solution to the puzzles Angel's Egg presents to us? If you ask me, I don't believe that that's the case. Any interpretation of media should be allowed to be heard and should be validated. Whatever you see in Angel's Egg, or any other piece of media or art, that interpretation is an extension of who you are. That's your identity. Why would you let someone else determine what it means to you? For you. Why not simply come to terms with these things on your own? That's not to say you shouldn't watch videos like this one or anything. Lord knows I need the views. But I think it's important not to let a video essay decide what you think of something, definitively. It's important to be your own person, be yourself, take all sides into account, and then decide for yourself what you think it all might mean. That's why I'm not giving any definitive explanations for Angel's Egg in this video, despite presenting quite a few different possible interpretations of it. The truth, whatever that might be, about Angel's Egg is probably somewhere in the middle, pieces of it in each analysis or deep dive into the film. But as I said before, and as Mamoru Oshii himself said, it's not the responsibility of the director to find meaning in his work. That task falls on the viewer. If you're not able to decide for yourself what Angel's Egg means to you, then, in my opinion anyway, you've missed the point. I mean no offense by this. I did make this whole video on it after all, and I do really appreciate you making it this far, and ultimately the purpose of my videos is typically to spark discussion rather than to give definitive answers anyway, as evidenced by how many of you politely told me I was wrong in the Made in Abyss video, and how much fun I had discussing that series with you all. But I still feel that it needs to be said that in this particular case especially, coming to your own conclusion about what it is and what it all means to you is so important. The search for meaning in Angel's Egg, or Asteroid City, or any other work like this is part of why it exists at all, and it is crucial, in my opinion, to the experience of watching it. After all, you can't wake up if you don't fall asleep, and you can't dream if you're always awake. So, let's talk about interpretations for a second here. If we look at things from the perspective of a YouTuber, say Chris Stuckman, Max Darrett, or Bonsai Pop, all great creators in their own right, we can see that their way of interpreting this type of art is the same as my way. They make videos about it because they feel strongly passionate about the original piece. sometimes these artistic reactions, the videos these interpreters of art make in response, are typically a lot easier to digest than the original. And in many ways, a good video essay can give you closure on a topic that you just can't quite come to terms with in a way that is lengthy, interesting, and satisfying. Heck, one of my favorite videos on the platform is Bonsai Pop's video on the genius of Devilman, and if you haven't seen that video, here it is. I highly recommend it. Please watch it. It will completely change the way that you see that series. And now, I'm not as smart or as good at making videos as any of the people I mentioned here today. And of myself, well, my own interpretation didn't seem like it was enough to get the full picture. And that's why, in lieu of getting a bunch of people to try and sit through Angel's Egg, I instead sent out a survey to some friends of mine who were willing. And that survey contained most of the same questions that I believed Angel's Egg was trying to ask me. In other words, I took the opportunity to ask how these themes would resonate with people of differing religious backgrounds, and what they thought they would answer those themes with. I asked them about their own deep-seated philosophies, and some of the answers I got out of that were incredible. In fact, those quotes that have been showing up every so often that are labeled anonymous, if labeled at all, those are not just random quotes I found. With the exception of the Wes Anderson one, which I've been using repeatedly in this video as an underlying theme, all of those quotes were actually taken from the answers to that survey. Now, we're not really going to get into that survey in more detail, because really it doesn't matter. It was just something that I felt I needed to do to better understand both the film and its themes and see how people in general and their viewpoints differ. Because to me that was important in making this video and making it the right way. But all of that aside, let's get back into the subject at hand, that being, of course, how video essayists or YouTube reviewers use their videos to share interpretations of art that's important to them. In the case of a critique, for example, the interpretation is more or less, I don't think this thing is very good and here's why, TM. But if we look at early YouTube, we find these interpretations often included skits, especially one rather infamous YouTuber in particular who I'm not the biggest fan of, but whose impact on the platform can't be understated. Before YouTube, though, what you might consider to be the equivalent of a video essay or response came in the form of two things. The first is the most obvious and inherently understandable: written works of contemplation, based on art that the writer had seen or experienced in some way. The second is something you might not immediately think of, but I promise you that it is equally important, and it continues to be used to this day in largely the same way. That's remakes. When we look at modern retellings of classic stories, we ought to view them as new additions to the vast pool of interpretations of this story. When we see Death Note's live-action Netflix film, what we're seeing is Adam Wingard's interpretation of the original work. This is how Wingard sees and views the messages of Death Note. No, it isn't quote-unquote as good as the anime or manga, but it's not really supposed to be. Netflix Note is a response, it's a video essay, it's a skit. It's the same as Aki Dearest's video on what she would use the Death Note for in real life. It's a passion project. It's meant to show the world how Adam Wingard views the original concept, to poke fun at it, to make light of it, and to tell of his experiences with it. And while yes, we can't always assume that this is the case for live-action remakes, especially when studio interference runs rampant and proper time and budget aren't given to a creator with a vision, we can see that in the case of extra creative freedom and passionate homage, paint a picture that, for these directors, this is a way for something they love to be shared with the world. This is their video essay, or video review. Instead of looking at Speed Racer as Speed Racer, look at it as, this is why I love Speed Racer. Zaniness, over-the-top colors, crazy acting. This is a love letter to the art that these directors were raised on. This is the art that made them feel something special. This is their way of paying homage to that, of representing it, instead of Death Note being a retelling exactly of the story, we need to look at it as a YouTube video titled, "What Would Happen if Death Note Took Place in the United States?" Or even, "Let's talk about the sense of scale and adventure in One Piece," instead of just looking at One Piece as a live-action remake. That's why I get excited for Hollywood to adapt these stories. Even if they screw it up, they can't ever take away what I love about the originals. They aren't trying to replace them with lackluster quote-unquote definitive editions. They're simply trying to respond to and pay homage to art. And in case you're wondering, the director will always show you the difference between a cash grab and an interpretation. You will know easily if you do just a bit of research on who's directing it and what they have to say about it. No, being a fan of the original isn't enough. Everyone says that. But when Andy Muschietti says Attack on Titan has themes that he loves and wants to explore in his own film adaptation, which, I don't know, will come eventually, probably, that's when it's okay to get really excited about seeing Attack on Titan as perceived by Andy Muschietti, not a sparkly Hollywood budget version of what we can already see done perfectly well in animation. Now, Octo, I hear you say from behind the screen, why are you talking about this right now? Aren't you getting a little off track with this? Weren't we talking about Angel's Egg? Angel's Egg doesn't have any Hollywood remakes. What gives? And that's where I respond by saying,
well, you're right. It's actually
only ever got released in Australia and the UK. When the rights to Angel's Egg were sold overseas, a little company called New World Pictures bought it for pennies on the dollar, as it hadn't initially been all that successful in Japan on release either. In fact, Oshii himself is quoted as saying that he lost a lot of future work offers because of Angel's Egg, but that he personally considers it to be among the most important of his works. It was like his baby. In other words, you could say it's like Oshii no Ko. Anyway, the idea was that New World Pictures would make money in the home VHS market releasing the film, because back in the late 80s when this all transpired, VHS home releases were kind of a huge deal. The main issue, though, came when the staff members who owned the distribution rights actually sat down and watched the film. At that point, the decision to splice it together with live-action skit segments was made because nobody in the staff had any idea how to interpret Angel's Egg. In other words, they thought it wouldn't sell unless they could get it to make some sense. Now, for most people, most non-creative, director-type people, I should say, I think a healthier response would be, I don't get this, but maybe someone else will, and release it as is, audience reception be darned. The problem is that the man in charge was not most non-creative, director-type people. He was Roger Corman. Corman's whole early career involved splicing together foreign films to make them more palatable, quote-unquote, for United States audiences, and he'd found a lot of success doing it, too. It's localization in the worst way, robbing audiences of the chance to interpret for themselves the art of the original creator. And this is where a remake causes a problem, when it tries to replace the original and actively tries to prevent you from ever seeing the original. But it is this exact mindset that led to the creation of the 1988 film, In the Aftermath. A spliced together mess of animation and low-budget live-action segments, which was basically lost media here until about 2019 or so, when Arrow Video did their due duty and restored and remastered the film in 4K, giving it a home video release in the process. Still no legal way to watch Angel's Egg here, though. That sucks. Yes, at face value, In the Aftermath is a terrible, terrible project, existing for the express purpose of replacing Oshii's thought-provoking original with something more akin to a popcorn flick. But, by my own reasoning and definition, it is an interpretation. In the same way someone like Nostalgia Critic cuts together skits and splices them with movie clips to make his own form of what could maybe loosely be defined as comedy. In the Aftermath, by my calculations, could be considered its own film, and frankly probably should be looked at as its own film, because Angel's Egg, it certainly is not. When we discuss In the Aftermath, we discuss the straightforward interpretation of a director, one who stated bluntly in an interview done for this 2019 re-release that he found the original film to be, quote, incomprehensible. In other words, In the Aftermath is the interpretation of someone who does not understand Angel's Egg at all. And this is their own sort of video response to it. One where he introduces his own headcanon to the story in order for it to make some sort of sense to him. In my eyes, that is worth something. It has to be, right? After all my talk of interpretation of Angel's Egg, and after 3 separate looks at the film, isn't it only fair we consider In the Aftermath its own form of interpretation of the original film? Well, I mean, I kind of did this to myself, but just to be clear, you can't really discuss the history of interpretations of Angel's Egg without discussing the most infamous take on the material. And considering we only just recently received more information on this film's production back in 2019, now feels like as good a time as any to revisit this film and see what, if anything, it has to add to the conversation. Immediately, we can understand that the idea of God forgetting his people was hard to accept for Corman, as he's clearly rejected it outright. Instead of this being an abandoned Noah's Ark, the world of In the Aftermath is actually a nuclear wasteland, which admittedly isn't all that large of a leap from the content of the original work, if I'm being honest. Giant weapons of mass destruction and ruins of empty cities seem to imply a post-apocalyptic setting for Angel's Egg, and we only understand the literal truth of this landscape at the very end of the film. And honestly, we only really get that if we know to look for it. The idea that man destroyed what God gave him, that it's humankind's fault, rather than the fault of a negligent creator, is rather interesting. It's a very self-centered idea. As if to say, I'm too important, God could never abandon me. So in setting alone, the difference in theology here is rather engaging to discuss. It makes me interested to see what else he's going to do with this. From here, we meet a group of original characters. A small group of about 2 survivors, at least 2 until he and his friend are attacked by your typical apocalyptic raiders that both you and I have seen at least 3 million times. Yes, there's a shallow message here about human nature. No, it's not done any better than it was in Moonfall, and therefore no, it is not worth our time to discuss the implications of this. It just happens. Oh yeah, and also, this guy's name is Frank, so I guess giving him a name and purpose prior to meeting Angel was important to the director. And that, despite the way the name sounds, is actually interesting. As we've seen, I believe Angel's Egg is, in large part, a contemplation on identity and theology. By having neither of the original's characters ever be outright named, we're forced to determine their identities by our own judgment, rather than what the director tells us about them. In this case, though, it's clear that the people here do, in fact, have some sort of identity, intended purpose, shallow though it may be. Even after the structure of the world is gone, in other words, one's sense of self, one's name and identity is still of value to them, even though there's not enough people left for that to really matter. It's almost as if he's trying to say that we need our sense of self to keep us going, much in the same way that Angel's Egg implied that some people need a sense of faith to keep them going. In that way, at least, In the Aftermath and Angel's Egg are on somewhat similar pages, if not by any stretch within the same book. Where all of this really differs is with the way Angel herself is depicted within the film. And that depiction is arguably the most important part of discussing In the Aftermath as an interpretation of Angel's Egg. For what could be more telling about one's interpretation of something than how he or she interprets and views the main character? The girl, who I've been calling Angel off and on throughout this video, sorry if that's been confusing by the way, is not from our planet in the Aftermath, but instead is portrayed as an alien messenger from another one who has come to see if mankind is worth being saved. Or if in the nuclear wasteland they should be left to, well,
Rot!
On the surface, as my partner pointed out to me while I was thinking out loud about this film with her, this makes the girl the closest thing to being an actual angel as any depiction in any variation of Angel's Egg actually has been up until now. Being that she's come to judge humanity from on high and all. Where this becomes a problem, however, is in the dialogue. There is far too much of it here for an adaptation of Angel's Egg to get away with. And I realize that's part of the reason this film got made at all, but my goodness, you guys, just let me think for a second without cramming your dialogue down my throat. Also, the boy is her brother in this movie, so that's not a great decision, I'd argue. It's not relevant to what I was saying at all. I'd just like to point out that that's not exactly what I would do, you know, if I were the one behind this production. That's all. Of course, I wouldn't have done any of this personally, so I guess my creative input doesn't really matter much here. Anyway, Angel as a character is portrayed, toward the beginning at least, as a snobby, bratty little girl who could care less about doing what, her brother, gosh, that's so weird, tells her is her due duty as an angel. The closest thing to a metaphorical point of interest or meaning in her portrayal is the question she asks about how she is to judge humankind. She asks how she can discern between those worth saving and those who aren't.
How will I be able to know who's deserving? Wouldn't it be better if you did this?
Because the force that makes the stars shine and the planets spin around will send your heart on the proper course.
That is an incredibly interesting question, actually. And somewhere within the borderline nonsensical response we get from Big Brother here, there is something that you could consider intent or philosophy. It's clear to me that someone, even if they didn't care much, did at least try to do their job and create something of value from this whole mess. And that, in and of itself, makes In the Aftermath worth at least watching with as much of an open mind as you find yourself able to muster, given its dubious creation history. But beyond that question, the story goes in pretty much the exact same direction you would expect it to. The live-action segments are incredibly low budget, and what little the on-screen actors do attempt to do is done with, as far as my research shows, very little given direction from anyone. Like, just take a look at what this film considers acting.
Nice tune, soldier.
Ugh, anyway. If it sounds like I'm torn in regards to my feelings about this film, both as an adaptation and as its own sort of interpretation, that's because I am. On the one hand, some of the most creative liberties taken in this project almost seem to enhance the original, and some of Angel's dialogue, taken on its own, separate from Angel's Egg or anything similar, does actually sound pretty decent and almost haunting. Just have a listen for yourself to a few of these.
I felt I was the only one present at a carnival of ghosts. It was filled with everything, but vastly empty.
Like, am I crazy, or does that actually, sound pretty good? In a different project, I'd argue these cryptic lines are, in all honesty, hauntingly beautiful. Here, though, they do tend to come off as, for lack of a better term, redundant, unnecessary. Yeah, that about covers it. Additionally, the film's unique question of having a young, premature angel decide the fate of humanity as a test both of her own judgment and as a test of the morality of post-nuclear fallout survivors is somewhat engaging on its own, but the conclusion you'll inevitably find yourself coming to is that, well, this isn't Angel's Egg. This is only loosely an interpretation of it at all. It is something that is equal parts irrelevant and critically important to the discussion of Oshii's original work. Had it been afforded a higher budget, and had it not shamelessly stolen Oshii's original animation and repurposed it, presenting it as its own, perhaps In the Aftermath could have been more accepted and successful among general audiences, and somewhere along the line found its own sort of cult following, which I'm sure this movie has somehow. Maybe if it had, we'd be discussing the film for entirely different reasons here today, unburdened by the constant need to compare and contrast it to what it knows all too well that it can never really be. Of course, for any of that to have happened, it probably would have actually needed to release on home video outside of the UK, and I guess anything beyond a limited theatrical release in Australia would have been nice for it. If anybody out there watching this ever actually experienced In the Aftermath on its own and remembers having any particular opinions on it, I would really love to hear your stories in the comments below. Man, discovering this film must have been something altogether bizarre. Your experiences are something I long to learn more about. In the end, though, In the Aftermath is reduced to being a sort of cut-together Frankenstein's monster of a film, one which, without question, doesn't understand the original work, but thankfully does not pretend to, either. It has, somewhere within its own bizarre little world, something to say about judgment, human nature, and trust. Just as, in many ways, its fully animated, far superior older brother has within itself. It's a bad film on the face of it, but not entirely because of its own actions, though those aren't easily forgiven by one who is at all familiar with the original, mind you.
Jonathan!
Oh my gosh, his name is Jonathan? They named him Jonathan. Oh, of all names. Jonathan? Oh dear gosh, no. Oh boy. In other words, In the Aftermath isn't hated because it's different than Angel's Egg. It's hated because, due to the way the rights for Angel's Egg were sold and used, it is the reason we can't have a stateside release of the original film. Therefore, the question becomes not whether or not this is a film worth preserving or seeing, or even interpreting as its own story or project, but instead a much more difficult question. Whether or not having access to this film is better than having access to Angel's Egg. And when such a direct comparison is forced like that, there's only one answer I'm inclined to come to. No. No, In the Aftermath is not better than Angel's Egg. No, I would not rather have a Blu-ray of it than Angel's Egg, and no, I don't think that if only one of the two could exist, that In the Aftermath would be anybody's first choice, or that most people would notice if it were gone, no matter how jazzy that soundtrack is. Ooh, but that is pretty nice, though. You gotta admit, that's pretty cool. But most is not all. And somewhere out there, I'm sure, is someone who found something in this film. Something about it must have touched them, or else a movement to preserve it and re-release it on Blu-ray so many years later simply would not have happened. No, we live in a world where both Angel's Egg and In the Aftermath exist. And that's something we have to accept, both as artists and as observers of art. Does that mean we can't still poke fun at some of the more mind-numbing editing and directing choices in the film? No, not at all. We can totally do that. I mean, just listen to this sound design. He sounds like he's pausing an RPG. It simply means that despite our jokes at its expense, some part of us still has to respect In the Aftermath, and understand that, as an interpretation, for the reasons given prior, maybe it doesn't entirely miss the point of the original after all. Even if it also mostly does. So why is it so important to live and let Angel's Egg be? Well, to that question, I have a simple, short, likely unsatisfying answer. Sometimes, a story has to tell itself. While making this video, I made an effort to understand the themes Angel's Egg presents to its viewers, and in an effort to understand how those viewers might react to Angel's Egg if they could better understand it, I had a large group of friends and relatives take a survey about those themes. I asked them questions about identity, religion, and judgment. But most importantly, I asked them about art. I asked them if an artist who let the story write itself, who had no clear intent for his work or plan going into it, could still create something of value. While the questions and their answers all helped in the writing of this video and helped me come to a better conclusion about Angel's Egg, this specific question about art was undoubtedly the question which helped me the most. When I asked this question, which you're seeing on screen right now, I received a plethora of answers, but the overwhelming underlying constant was a resounding yes. From the subconscious, from the mind, art is a reflection of ourselves, whether we choose to accept that or not. And beyond that, how we view and interpret that art can be equally important. Without Akira, there would be no Matrix. And with no Matrix, there would be no Animatrix, and so on and so forth. Art is a blooming flower, spreading seeds to sprout and grow elsewhere. changing and adapting to its environment. And in no water is this fact clearer reflected than in the rivers and streams of Angel's Egg, and the mind of Mamoru Oshii. Indeed, when we let creation run itself, we find man's truest of works, unhindered by social obligation, expectation, or story structure. Inevitably, what we create reflects us, and perhaps in no purer way can we unleash this subconscious than through the art we make when we allow it to flow, unobstructed. The best and most prolific of works are created when we stop overthinking ourselves, when we let the pen freely flow. Angel's Egg, Haibane Renmei, Majora's Mask. But rather than interpret the artist behind these works, sometimes the best way something so special and purely creative as Angel's Egg can be interpreted is by yourself. The quotes which have appeared alongside the chapter headings in this video all came, as stated earlier, from people just like you, dear viewer. These too are the reflections of humanity, shown through the way people answer even the simplest of questions on a survey. If they mean anything to you, hold on to them as yourself. Let your identity shine through in what and how you see the world, and in what you take from it. Because the way I see it, you can let the world and everything in it change you, or you can do precisely the opposite. But above all else, of all the questions you may be asked in life, only one is truly important. It's at this critical moment of narrative conclusion, though, that I find myself emotionally stuck, lost in my own train of thought. If all I've talked about today is in regards to the importance of interpretation and how you can't get anything out of something like Angel's Egg unless you've seen and analyzed the film yourself, what role have I had in any of that self-discovery other than some sort of shortcut or easy explanation? What was even the point of me making this whole video just to tell maybe a couple hundred people how I feel about an anime everyone of any semblance of critical importance above and beyond myself has already discussed? Who am I to tell you what to think of anything? I'm just an octopus reviewing anime on the internet, and really, I'm not even that. I'm just a guy. I have a crappy microphone, a soundproofing blanket, I can't cook an egg to save my life. What do any of you get out of watching me talk about identity or anime philosophy? Are you even there? When I make videos, just as often as they reach thousands, they come across to me as though I'm screaming into the void. No one to hear or care what I have to say. And why should they? I didn't make Angel's Egg. I've never done anything of significance or real importance. You might argue this very video betrays and destroys the point of Angel's Egg in the first place, that publicly analyzing it robs all who see it of the opportunity to do so for themselves. If I give you closure, an answer you're satisfied with, what reason could you possibly have to watch it again and find your own answer? I find myself unable to answer any of these questions. I don't know everything. Sometimes I feel like I don't know anything. Yet here we are, at the end of an overly long and deceptively vague video analysis of Angel's Egg, wondering much the same thing we were when this video began. What does it all mean? And unfortunately, I don't have a definitive answer for that question. I'm sorry. When I look in the mirror, the film's opening words echo in my mind. And I suppose, at the end of the day, that's the only question that really matters, isn't it? I think maybe some amalgamation of all that. Maybe that's what Angel's Egg is really about. That's what I think. But I can't think for you. I can only write and edit low-quality YouTube videos. That's who I am. At least, that's who I think I am. That is what Angel's Egg means to me. But as for all of you, I trust you know by now what it means to you. And if what it means to you is the film is nonsensical, I don't understand it, then that's fine too. Because that's what you think. That's not what I told you to think. Not every dream has to mean something, but most of them do mean something, don't they? To some degree or another. In order to dream, you need to have memories to organize, things that you've seen. You have to experience the world around you in order to grow. But eventually, you will, like Angel, have to sleep. You have to feel confused sometimes. You have to think and stew and ponder. Because, simply put, you can't wake up if you don't fall asleep. Hey, so that was a video. I normally wouldn't, especially after a video like that, appear in all of my echoey, poor microphone quality glory to tell you more information, but since I don't know when the next upload from this channel is going to be, or at least the next upload that has me as the starring role, I wanted to give you a little bit of a heads up on some things that are going on that you might want to check out, especially since some of the other projects on the channel could definitely use a bit more of your support. Honestly, I think they're higher quality than this garbage video was. This took me a very long time to make. Please like it. Well, first off, Bibliomania Project. It's an animation project we're doing based off of a manga called Bibliomania. It's to raise awareness for the original work. I animate that entirely by myself and entirely on a Samsung Galaxy Note 9. It is not very impressive, but it is a lot of fun, and a lot of the voice actors really pull their own weight. Who am I kidding? Not a lot. All of them really pull their own weight and do a great job. And the more we make content about it and the more people know about it, the more likely it is that the original manga will get released. So please go and support that. Secondly, my buddy TheMissingLettr, also known as Connor, whose channel this is, that I commandeer sometimes, he's got a new video coming out as well, and it's going to be awesome. He's talking about Kingdom Hearts. He had his first Kingdom Hearts experience this year, and if you know anything about Kingdom Hearts, you'll know that that's a lot. That's a big pill to swallow. And make sure you go support him. You'll be able to find the link to that video in the description of this one as soon as that video goes live. So make sure that you check that out. If you want more from me, more long-form analysis, might I recommend the Wonder Egg priority video. I put a lot of effort into that one, especially if the only other video you've seen from me is Maven Abyss themed. Please go check out the Wonder Egg video and give that as much love as you possibly can. The Suzume video, you can forget that one. I've already forgotten it exists. It was a huge flop. But the Wonder Egg video, please go and support that. Anyway, that's all for me, and I will see you guys next time I do a video. Thanks for watching. Later.